finally to the final chapter of the textbook, which looks at working with relationships that happen within the workplace. So let's start off with this idea about how workplace relationships develop. I think if you've had any kind of workplace situation, you probably might be able to identify maybe some different types of relationships that you might have had in those situations, whether they're a little bit closer and you made friends that you kept forever, or if they were kind of a temporary situation and you just kind of passed through each other's lives and moved on. I can say for me, I have at least one friend that I got from one of the restaurants I worked at. I think I met her back in 1991 and still extremely good friends. Another friend, yeah, another one I had from school, from high school. So those, those relationships that you just create that kind of connection. And I think if you looked at us from outside, you'd go, these people don't belong together. I mean, they don't seem like they match each other. And, we do. It's just, it doesn't look like it from the outside. So we just became really good friends and we were able to share life experiences. And so she's one of those kind of friends. So let's take a look at a couple areas that we're going to look at in this first section, which is dimensions, culture, networks, organizational climates, and technology. So looking at some of the dimensions that they discuss here, the first thing we're going to look at is a couple elements that kind of go into defining maybe what the workplace looks like across a couple of variables. Because I think when we look at workplaces, I mean, they're so diverse as far as, the way that those relationships look in a workplace, the climate that's been created, how people interact, the way the location is set up, whether it's set up for people to be able to relate to each other, or if it's kind of encouraged that you're separate or distinct from other people and you don't really share. So I think the first one looks at status or hierarchy, power. So when I worked at my call center, there was a lot of organizational structure, and you almost would, I would always look in there and to see how far away I was from the CEO of the company. They had a little organizational chart, and it would tell me how far I was away. I think I was 5. I think I was 5 away. And it didn't really mean that I actually had that much power or anything. It was just kind of a fun thing that I did just to see how things were oriented or ranked. It was a big company, a Fortune 500 company. There's a lot of levels, a lot of distinction. And when you have a company like that, there's going to be a lot more structure. The company is going to have a lot more rules just because they need them to create consistency and coherency. So it wasn't a fun place necessarily to work. There was a lot of expectations and rules about how you were supposed to act. And, like I said, larger companies kind of require that. This element of intimacy, or what the relationship is between people, some of that's going to depend on, just your personality, but some of it does depend on what the company allows. In the call center environment, we joked because they were organized in what they call pods. So if you ever watched Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you know what a pod people are. But we basically were set up with the supervisor in the center, and all of the other people were organized around that center cubicle. So if you looked at that, it would suggest to you, just by looking at the way that the place was organized, that there were walls separating the individual employees, and then a supervisor in the center, meaning that they were supposed to have easy access to that supervisor. So that, it didn't necessarily allow for a lot of intimacy. You weren't talking on the phone all the time. There really wasn't a lot of downtime in between what you were doing. It was taking phone call after phone call. So I think it was more about keeping out extra noise than it was necessarily blocking people from relating just because they didn't have time. There really wasn't an opportunity to relate, at least during the hours that I worked. I think maybe if you got there later off time, you might have had a little bit more of that, but not in the time that I was working there. And then there's the idea of choice and sort of willingness to participate in engaging with other people in the environment. Um, how open people are to connecting with others, if they're welcoming them in or if they're kind of keeping them away. So you have all these elements that kind of fall into what that looks like. So not only do you have the dimensions, but you just have the culture. So I think they feed into each other. The dimensions, could influence what the culture looks like, and then how these people are going to relate to each other. So if we look at the organizational culture, we can look at just the general values of the workplace. So how dedicated are people to the organization? How do they see workplace performance? Is that seen as something that's going to be important? Are your numbers posted? So in a call center environment, they would post your numbers, or they would have your numbers maybe available for people to see. In some situations, I was working mostly in the training department, so we would post the numbers so people could see how they did in comparison with the other people in the environment. So there was this element, sort of a little bit of competition that went on in that environment, so that they were trying to get people to perform at a high level by creating a level of competition there as well. The norms would be the guidelines and information kind of governing the relationships and how relationships can look within that organization. Again, if you've got walls dividing you and there's really not much time to talk, it's going to be difficult for you to have a lot of relationships with other people. Now, I had a lot of employees that their friends worked there, and they would come by and pick them up if they could for break or whatever, so they could go hang out with each other during that period of time. So that would happen sometimes for people in that environment, but it didn't lend itself to that for sure. There's also artifacts, so the objects and structure that define that organization. In our case, I was working with a satellite provider, so there was all kinds of fun things that happened. We got lots of what they call swag, or I think of the other word for it, but it's swag. It's something that you're given by the providers. So we would get stuff from HBO and from Showtime and from Cinemax and from the different networks. Stress balls, lots of stress balls. We had those all the time. Notepads, videos. We had pens. We had just toys and trinkets to play with while you're sitting at your desk. So lots of things that help define that, but also as new satellites were launched, they would get little coins that we would get. So I collected all of the coins, I think from the third launch of the third satellite on up, and I can't remember how far up I went, but I collected these little coins for each of the launches, and that was something that was going to be specific to the industry that I was working in. So those would be artifacts and information that might be oriented towards my particular company. There was always new programs that were coming out, so maybe we were being familiarized with what those would be, if they had big channels and movies coming out. I think when I was working there, Titanic had just come out, and it was a movie that was being shown there, so I remember a big huge poster. A lot of I think I remember there being a poster for Dexter. So I know some of this is old school for some of you guys, but the idea is, there was a certain culture that was there because we were working with a lot of channels and networks. So that's kind of the way our organizational culture was set up in particular. So we have those. We have culture, and then along with that goes this idea of networks. This isn't social networking. This is the networks that happen within the company. We talk about something called sociograms in companies, and is kind of recognizing who relates to who's connected to who. If we were to break it down and look at the number of times someone talked to another person that was equal to them, that was lower than them, that was above them, we would kind of see sort of a representation of the culture maybe in a linear format, but we're just kind of looking at the way that information is flowing. So the type of information might be related to work, or it could be related to rumors. So we have those elements that kind of happen within that environment. And so networks lend themselves to how much communication or connection you have with other people. We also have modalities or sensory channels as far as how information flows. And this might be how you relate. So are you relating to people on a face-to-face situation? Are you talking to them through video conferencing? Do you use instant messaging, emailing? I think at the call center that I worked at, as I was leaving, they were starting to work on creating virtual environments. So the supervisor would be watching the employees, and the employees would be working at home. And they instituted some technology that allowed them to monitor what was happening with the agents in their home. Not that they were watching them per se physically, but they were watching what they were doing. So we had after call. So what you would do when you were done with the call and you weren't ready to take the next one, how much of that time were you using? How much hold time were you using? So all those numbers and metrics that they use in an environment like that, they were able to do even though it was a virtual network, so that everything was being done and people were working from home. And they definitely have more of that going on just because it costs so much to keep people in an environment, and people have to drive in and they don't want to drive in, and technology has allowed us now, based on its ability and the increase in quality of the networks, to be able to work from home relatively well and have consistent internet connection, and the environment is kind of set up, and now they can monitor truly what's happening with agents while they're at home. And yeah, so even though they're at home, there's a lot of information that can be gathered because they're logging into a system, and that system is tracking that information. And another element is the density of those connections. So how connected is one person to another? You might have one person just because they're very friendly and very connected to other people, where they might really reach out and have a lot of friendship connections with other people. You might have it happen because somebody has a specific job that encourages them to be connected. Maybe they work in a location or a space where everyone has to pass them, and so they might end up making connections that way. So those are all elements that are going to kind of fall into that environment. Now, another element that happens with this is you might have workplace cliques that happen, and these happen a little bit more sometimes based on the type of work that someone might do. Sometimes they happen just because people just got out of high school and they haven't quite grown up yet. Forgive me, but that's we had a lot of people that were just out of high school or still in high school that were working there, and a lot of the mentality that was left over from high school came with them into the work environment, and they were blocking people from being involved. And so yeah, so they can be helpful in that maybe you connect with somebody and maybe someone acts like the welcoming committee, and they might help you come in and teach you maybe what you need to do in order to be part of this particular culture and help you improve productivity. If you're smart, you find who those people are and really work to connect with them if you have that as an opportunity. So I think they're just important things to keep in mind from the work environment. And underneath that idea of this network piece is you need to keep in mind, if you're in the work environment, private is public. So I had a fellow employee that would send all kinds of emails out to everyone. They would find emails online and they would send them out to everybody else. And they weren't work related. They were fun, and sometimes inappropriate, and I would send them to myself, but I never sent them to anybody else, which kept me from being fired. They actually called me into the office and said, hey, we know these emails were sent to you. We also noticed that you didn't send them to anybody else in the workplace. I got to keep my job. My friend that was sending out these emails to everybody got fired. So I think the important thing to know is it doesn't matter if you're in a work environment, you're being monitored and they're watching your emails, and they have every right to look at the emails that you have in your workplace. It's your private stuff, it's different, but if you're using a work computer in order to access it, you need to know that that might be monitored or tracked. So companies are doing that in order to keep track of what's happening with how you're interacting with your computer during work time, and they may notice that. So I think you need to keep in mind how you're interacting with that, and then also, how good you are at connecting with other people can help you or inhibit you from moving up in the company. So if you build good relationships with people that are your superiors, or you're just friendly with people, I'm always doing what I can to be polite to everybody. If I can be polite to everybody, I'm going to be polite to them. Sometimes I have a bad day and I might not be nice for a moment, but for the most part, I'm always going to be polite to people. I'm generally not going to say anything negative about other people. I'm not going to do things that are going to cause issues down the road. I don't want to do stuff where somebody repeats what I said, that there's going to be some kind of issue with that. I'm just going to try to keep it on the up and up and build relationships with people that are above me, because it does give me access to more information. And if I have built a friendship with somebody, then I can connect with them more easily. And if I need something, or I have an idea, or I have a project I need to push through, I've built relationships with people that allow me to do that. So this lends itself to this idea of the climate and how organizations and the feel of the organization look. So the climate of the organization is kind of looking at the overall tone of that organization, and it relates to things like trust and openness and listening and supportiveness. So you might look at those as different criteria as you're measuring one work environment to another, and you can tell a lot by the way that the organization's been set up. You can look at the organizational charts. You can look at the way that people relate to each other. This idea of an open door policy and there's a door suggests that maybe it's not as open door. I remember in the call center, outside of the director of the call center, no one had doors pretty much. Most of the time, well, and then there were some other managers in other departments, but for the floor where the agents were, outside of the director, there weren't any doors. So everything was open. There were cubicles, but there were walls and spaces that could be walked into if they needed to. I don't think that people necessarily feel comfortable with it, but they could if I wanted to. And there's a couple criteria that go along with climate, in that you have types of climates. The first one being defensive, where it might feel a bit more defensive or rigid, or unsupportive. And I can say in a call center, again, it's a large company. It was very hierarchical, so there were lots of levels. It wasn't necessarily easy for you to move around in that environment as much, where you might have other environments. Certainly in the college environment, there's a little bit more flow. I think in the college environment as well, as an instructor, there's the assumption, certainly if I've achieved a master's degree, that I have a certain amount of autonomy and can think for myself, so they don't necessarily feel like they need to manage me. I've been known to take a nap or two on campus, just put my head down because it's my time. So I'm kind of like my own little boss. Not completely, but to some degree I have a little bit of autonomy over what happens to myself in my time. And you might have an environment that's a little bit more supportive, that where people are being a little bit more warm or open. There's sort of cooperation that's happening in that environment. So you have those elements that are happening. You have these different environments and how they look. So if we look at technology that happens in the workplace, oh wait, let me go through this part. How do you create a supportive environment? You'll notice that some environments just feel different from others. And some of it actually has to do with the organizational climate. And organizational climate can be set up by the people that create the environment. A lot of that happens with the supervisors and the bosses that are in that environment. So, do they set you up so you feel like you have to lie? I remember being in a restaurant, and I remember doing the numbers. We had to do inventory every week, and they almost made the goals so hard to achieve that it was hard to achieve them. Now, I wasn't the person that was in charge of that. I would just keep track of the numbers, but I know that I worked with some people that were altering things a little bit in their favor, just so they would, look good. So it didn't really set things up for honest communication. It didn't create an environment where people felt safe to say what needed to be said. So that, that's setting that up in the front is a good idea. Being flexible as far as how you treat people, as far as suggestions. We talk about upward and downward flow of communication. Most organizations, the information flows down. So the people at the top make a decision, the information flows down to the people at the bottom. They're supposed to take the information that's given to them, and they're supposed to follow through with it. But you do have some organizations that allow information to also flow up. So they take feedback and suggestions from the employees and implement those suggestions, and then encourage them to participate and give them that information. Personally, talking to the people that were on the front lines and dealing with the customers on the front lines from day to day was really a good place to go, because a lot of times they had ideas, but they didn't really have a good place to share them. So creating a collaborative environment where people aren't trying to manipulate each other, that's also helpful, in having a supportive environment. Making sure that you are focusing on describing challenges rather than putting blame on a specific person. So we have this particular situation going on, let's see if we can figure out how to handle it, rather than saying it's this person's fault. When you have that kind of situation, then no one's going to be in a position to want to step forward or do anything, because they're going to be cast down or pushed down by what's happening in that situation. Make sure you're offering concern. So if you have employees that are in a difficult situation, expressing empathy, respect, understanding, listening to what their situation is, I think that's important. I remember working in another school, and we would talk about it, because sometimes the students would tell us that their grandparent had died, and we were actually on their third or fourth set of grandparents. So, they were abusing the situation by saying that someone had passed away, and so it kind of makes you a little bit jaded, as an administrator, because you're hearing the same thing over and over again. And seriously, they forgot that they told you that, and then they told you again that a grandparent had passed away, and it was the same grandparent. So, I think it's important to offer concern, and I think if people feel free and open to discuss that, I think that helps. And then the idea of having equality and having situations where people are treated with respect, I think that's really valuable, and in helping people feel like they're in a place where they feel safe, they feel comfortable. When you have an environment where people feel like they're going to get fired tomorrow, that doesn't feel safe, and that doesn't feel comfortable. I don't know anybody that wants to hang out there. It's just not a great place to be. So technology is another area to take a look at, and we're in a different world now. I mean, if you go back, I remember the sound of your internet connecting. The sound that your internet used to make, because it was dial-up. and how long it used to take. I remember, playing a computer game in between waiting for the page to load on the internet, and how long that took in order to get those things taken care of. So we've really moved forward as far as the stability of our internet connection, the speed of the internet connection, the ability to use it, and all the different varieties of technology that are available to us that allow us to stay in contact and connection with other people. So I don't know that this is true. I can say on the first three, I question this. The textbook suggests that some of the advantages would be equal participation, less interruption, and more democratic. I can say from my experience that I've had situations where none of those were true. So maybe that's not necessarily always true, but it might help in some situations if maybe you have a flowing chat and people are able to do that, because sometimes if people are talking, that's going to be more controlled. But if you were looking at the chat window, you might see more of a flow of information that might be happening in some of the meetings that you might attend. So for my online school that I teach for, we have meetings twice a month, and we use Zoom. And there's a chat window, and the chat is where most of the conversation's going on and the interaction. And then the person that's leading the meeting might be interacting also with the chat, but they are, the chat might be going on independent, and someone else might be answering the questions in the chat. So you'll see a different variety of things that happen. I think this idea of time and geography, we have really given ourselves some flexibility as far as how we might interact with people that aren't part of the same time zone that we're in, because we don't have to travel to somebody per se. You do kind of have to pay attention to what time zone and stuff things are, because I know for my online students, I have them across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I have to be very clear in my communication. In our case, we're always dealing in mountain time for the school because the school is located in Utah and it's on mountain time as well. So yeah, making sure that you're being very clear about what time things are happening at is important with the technology. But geographically, we're kind of collapsing that a little bit because we do have technology that allows us to communicate over, it doesn't matter where we're located. Like I said, I have students on the East Coast, I have students on the West Coast, and I'm able to interact with all of them. I just have to make sure they're clear about the time. Some disadvantages of the technology are that there's constant distraction. So one of the ones it mentions in here is this idea of cyber slacking. So people get on the internet and they post stuff to social media and they get on their emails. Again, I think the thing you need to consider is who's watching, and if you're using the technology that belongs to you, or if it belongs to the work environment. You can oftentimes be tracked, so they know what you're doing with your time. And I put down here, I added this idea of technical difficulties because I've had them happen to me myself at home. And I was using one internet provider and trying to teach online classes, and then right before I was supposed to get on, it stopped working and I couldn't teach my class. And I was like, this doesn't work for me. I had to switch providers. So yeah, it forced me to switch providers because there's no way I can live that way. If I've scheduled a class to run from 6 to 8 p.m. on Monday night, I need to be available from 6 to 8 p.m. on Monday night, and my internet needs to be there. So the technical difficulties can be an issue. Certainly if there are any issues that are happening with the program that you're using, those can be challenges. But as time goes by, technical difficulties end up being less and less. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the ideas and concepts that kind of go into defining what a workplace environment looks like. So let's go ahead and stop with that. So thank you, and I'll move on to the next section. Thank you.